Um, yeah, and we're live. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone watching either live now or later. It is my absolute pleasure to be joined today by both Susana Imaginario and Christopher Ruocchio. Christopher, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
No, no, no. Trust me, the honor, the pleasure is all mine. We can blame and thank your editor David Butler for sorting this meeting. That was a Christmas present come early for me. Um, right, I always start with the same question with everyone, so you get no get out of jail free card here. Was your story from I don't know dreaming of being a writer, thinking about it, to actually getting your first book published? What's the journey been like?
Yeah, so it in a lot of ways it's pretty, I think, typical. I knew really early on I wanted to write stories. I've always loved story, right? I was always a science fiction fan. My parents were very strict about what I could watch on television as a kid because I was the oldest child. But I was allowed to watch Star Wars because they had seen Star Wars, so and they liked it. So I watched the original trilogy on Laserdisc. So I watched the unlucased versions, the actual original versions, sort of on loop as a kid. I just sort of I was just all over it, and so from there I started to read pretty early. I think I was 4 when Harry Potter came out, and that was sort of an unavoidable thing, right? I wouldn't say I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, but it had an impact on me as a kid. And so I was reading that early, and from there I went into Lord of the Rings when the movies were coming out, and it was also everywhere again, right? Like Lord of the Rings, I mean, it's never gone anywhere, but it definitely had its moment around 2000, right? And so I read The Hobbit, and then my parents got me the audiobooks for Lord of the Rings itself because those were a little bit above my level. I was maybe 8 or so around the time the movies were coming out. And that was about the time I decided that I wanted to write. And so I started seriously trying to figure out how to be a writer very, very young. I was like 8, 9. I tried to start writing. I had no idea like how much writing it took to make a book or anything like that, right? But I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so always, all the way through school, no matter what I was actually sort of trying to orient myself toward, I thought for a while, oh, I should go into physics and like do science and like work for NASA. That would be cool. It turns out I'm very bad at math. So I gave up on that pretty quickly. Of course, maybe could have been another job at NASA I could have done without math, but that's all right. I was always sort of aiming in this direction, and I ended up going to college for an English degree, which was not my most strategic choice in my life ever. But while I was there, I landed an internship working for Baen Books, who are a science fiction fantasy publisher here in the U.S. I interned with them in 2015. They hired me in 2016, but about 2 days before they hired me, my agent, who I had gotten a couple months before that, had sold my book to their competition. So I was published by Daw Books, and then I worked for Baen Books for several years. I quit Baen, I want to say, in 2021. I'm very bad at remembering dates in my own life. History, fine, right? I know exactly when Magna Carta was, but not when I quit my job. But I've been writing full time ever since. As far as getting the agent is concerned, I basically did that the sort of classical way. I wrote pitch emails and got rejected some 50 something times, and finally got an agent who I'm still with, and I've been working ever since.
So, just the whole agent thing. Did getting that internship and that job at Ben help you with that? Were you sort of a little bit on the inside?
Only in like a very, very simple way, and that was that while I was at Baen, I got access to they had a Sci-Fi Writers Association directory, so that had contact information in it for all the agents, so it saved me some Googling.
Yeah.
But I didn't. I had my college professor, my faculty advisor, when I was in college, had a couple of Nebula awards. His name's John Kessel. He writes a lot of short fiction. And he looked over my query letter for me when I was in school still, because I was racing towards graduation and did not know what my plan was going to be. So he was looking over that for me, and he introduced me to his agent, who ended up rejecting me. But that was like my only real in, was that. So between that and then having the emails for the other agents, that was sort of the only leg up I really had there, because I didn't want to be one of the interns that came to work for Baen who was really only there to get published, right? Because in the years I worked there after, basically every other intern that we signed on was really just trying to get published. And so that you could tell, right? They would just show up and they would talk all the time about what they were writing. And I was worried that if I had done that, then it would look like nepotism and people would say, oh, you didn't really earn, your book being out. So I was kind of quiet about it. They knew I was writing, but I never made a big noise about it. And I just borrowed the contact information and figured I'd try the real way. But I did submit to my employer at the time. It's just that Daw was faster. Daw got very excited about the books. This was in January 2016. I think the editor at the time, so I had 2 editors when I was with them, read the books overnight, and then she called me the next day and was like, "These are great. Would love to make you an offer." And so I had a couple other publishers who were interested. I was just like, "Hey, I just got a really good offer, so I'm going to take this one." And so if I'd waited, maybe there would have been some bidding and I could have stood to make more money. But I ended up with what was at the time a very good deal, and I haven't looked back really. So
no regrets. So your first published book is a book 1 in Sun Eater.
Yeah. Empire of Silence was my first novel. I sold that in January 2016. It didn't come out until 2018 because publishing can be slow sometimes.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a slowdown. During that time, I wrote book 2. So book 2 was finished before the first one came out, and then I wrote a couple short stories. And I try not to sit still for too long. But
that's a little bit abnormal, isn't it? That your first novel is the one that gets published and gets you in, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, first novel in that sense. So I did actually write a book in high school that I did not publish. It's probably only really a novella. Maybe it's a little bit longer. Barely a novel. I don't actually know how long it is because I only have one copy of it left, and it's printed out in manuscript form. So I don't have the file anymore. But it was a fantasy novel, and it's kind of terrible. So it's kind of silly that I still have it at all. But Empire of Silence was my first serious attempt because I was in high school. I must have been 15 or something. We can't all be Christopher Paolini, so I sort of gave up on that one and didn't really count it. But it is, I think, unusual. I think a lot of people write 1 or 2 books maybe, and then it's the second or the third that they go back, and then they'll maybe publish those earlier books later. Or especially now with self-publishing, who knows? Often someone's first book's actually out somewhere, and you haven't seen it, or
Okay.
But yeah.
All right. So I just want to sort of hopefully delve deeper into the Sun Eater. So what is it, Sun Eater or the Solang Empire? What's the actual name of the series?
The series is Sun Eater. Yeah.
Sun Eater. Okay.
Yeah. I made my website Sullen Empire before I thought about this.
Okay.
I sort of stuck with a different website, but that's
right.
Okay.
So how does it work? Obviously, you've got the core of is it 6 books?
It's 6 now. It will be 7.
It will be okay.
Yeah, one more.
So because after Ashes of Man, we've got the next one that Susana and I are going to pick up, and there's another one coming next year. Then is it?
Yeah, it's the plan. Yeah, Disquiet Gods is book 6 that comes out in April from Baen here in the U.S. because there's a little bit of a publisher hiccup. I had to change publishers. That's a long story. But Baen's picked up the last 2 books, and then book 7 will be out probably around August, September 2025. Then the series will be done.
Okay. So we've got the 7 books, but then you've got the 2 novellas, and there's a few comic books. So how does it all fit in? What's the idea behind having these different formats of stories set in the same universe?
Yeah, so it's 3 novellas now. I had one come out just in December. So there's a third one that just came out. The comic books, so the only comic book I've done, I did one short story for Marvel Comics about Thor, the superhero. So that might be what you're picking up on. It's not related to Sun Eater at all. I would love to do Sun Eater comics at some point.
Okay.
But I did. I picked up a short gig working for Marvel. Steve McNiven, who drew Civil War and Old Man Logan, is a fan of my books, which was quite a surprise. He's a wonderful guy and a brilliant artist, and he asked if I wanted to do a story with him, so I did that just the once. And Marvel has not spoken to me since, which is fine. I would much rather work on my own stuff than work on Spider-Man, because I could never like Spider-Man would never be mine, right? So like I would rather do my own thing. But as far as the novellas and the short stories, because there are about 24 short stories as well. My sort of thinking was twofold, or threefold, really. One was that traditional publishing, you only really get paid twice a year, and that's kind of tough. So it was a pragmatic decision. Whereas with self-publishing, places like Amazon will pay out monthly, and so I could get something more like a regular payment. So I thought if I write some shorter stuff and I'll put them out through Amazon, I could make a little bit more of a regular income, which would be easier on my family. So that was part of it. Another part too was that if you write novels, you could probably only do one a year, maybe two a year. I know some indie writers will write 3 or 4 a year, but I am not as skilled at writing at speed as they are. So I thought, hey, if I write one novel a year, then it's going to be another year or so before my publisher can put it out, because publishers are slow moving beasts. So what if I write something shorter and I can put that out faster on my own? Because I'm not trying to manage 8 books a month like a publisher is, right? And so I figured, why don't I do that? I can get the copy editing done, get the covers made, and get them out on my own recognizance. And if I do that, then I'm giving my readers more than one event a year. Because you don't. We're always competing for audience attention, right? And that gets increasingly hard in a world where you're not competing just with other writers, but you're competing with cinema and streaming and video games and YouTube videos and TikTok. And good Lord, like, YouTube, there's another video every, 10 minutes, right? If you subscribe to enough channels. And so it's, when I say compete, I don't mean like, it's a zero-sum game, right? Like I'm not trying to take from other people, right? But I am competing for attention, right? People can only spend 5 minutes the same way once, right? And if I don't put out stuff quickly enough, my fear is that my audience will forget about me, right? Like if it took me 12 years to write a book, I do not have the privilege of having a globally renowned HBO series, so people
In
might
due time.
maybe right, but people might forget about me. I'm not famous enough to do nothing for a decade, right? So I need to, and I don't mean that pejoratively. George Martin is a great writer, but he does have the privilege of being able to take his time, whereas my fear is that I need to work very hard, right, to sort of keep people's attention and to build attention and all of that stuff. So I thought the novellas would help me do that between books faster. My original plan had been to write one between each book, but then my fourth novel got split in half, and I had some personal stuff that sort of prevented me from doing that between books 3 and 4. And so it hasn't quite worked out where there's one between each book, but I've done 3 now for 6 books, so it's not, I only missed 2 novellas. But, I plan to write more later.
But to be fair, Christopher, you're insultingly young and quite prolific. You've already got 6. They're not 300-page novels. You got 6 chunkers out plus the novellas. So I mean, I wouldn't put don't put yourself down. But then that's the question: like, what's your writing? Your approach to writing? Are you like a Stephen King type person that you take as your job to get so many thousand or so many hundred words done per day? Is that the approach?
Yeah. No, I mean, it is my job, right? My wife works too, and she goes to work 5 days a week. And so if I didn't, I would feel bad about myself, I think. So I do. I get up. I have a 8-month-old daughter now, which makes life a little bit harder. But I get up at about 5 a.m. and I work until she wakes up, which is usually around 8. By which time I've usually written about 1,000 words, and then she will be awake for a couple hours and then take a nap. And then usually by the end of that nap, I've written about 2,000 words in a day. Last couple of weeks, I have not hit those targets. It's been kind of difficult weeks, but that's sort of the prototype. That's sort of the idea is to do that. And then a very committed outliner. The outline for book 7 is something like 50,000 words long, so it's longer than my novellas. I sort of think about those outlines as low resolution first drafts. So I, in a sense, have written the book, but I've written the book in such a way that like a chapter is like a page, right? And
Yeah.
so, as I think a lot of writer's block is down simply to a failure to have planned what is going to happen. I think it's mostly like a plot pile up, basically. I think the stuff like characters and the actual writing. You know, I like to tell this joke, right? It's like you'll say that you have writer's block, and then you will go on Facebook and you will see your friend has said something stupid, and you will write 3,000 words responding to your friend about how dumb they are, and the writing actually is fine. You could write the whole time. It was something else that was blocked. So the outlining has solved a lot of my writer's block issues. Often, if I'm having a hard time writing, it's because my outline is maybe too thin. So if I get stuck for a couple days, I'll go and look at the outline again, and I will add to it, and that usually helps me to unjam the flow. So.
Okay, I get no. That's very interesting. So you know exactly where the story's going. You've got it all planned out. Has it at any point sort of taking a life of its own and run a little bit away from you?
Sure. You know, there've been a few times. There's usually a couple times in every book where I'll get somewhere and realize that I had not planned very well, or I'd like missed something, or I'll have a new idea. And when I do that, I'll sit down and I will readjust the outline, and I'll think, okay, well, how do we make this new idea work? And maybe I rewrite the next like 4 chapters of the outline or something, or add a chapter, or take one away, or something like that. You know, because I think the fear with outlining that a lot of writers have is that it will rob them of their spontaneity, right, of their creativity. And if you feel that way, then maybe you're not like planning in the way that's best for you, because your tools as a writer should serve your writing, right? And if they aren't, if they're making you feel stifled, then that isn't the right tool. So there are times when, you know, I'd write myself into a corner, right, and be like, oh, I don't know how to solve this problem. Well, you know, something has to give, and it's either what I've written needs to get deleted, or what I was planning to write needs to change. And in either of those cases, you know, I usually do whichever one feels right, which often is deleting the things that I've written and not changing the outline, unfortunately, which is a lot more work. But sometimes, you know, I'm able to take the easier way out and change the outline or something like that. But
So
yeah.
So how hard it is, and this is also a question for Susana as a writer, how hard it is to get the scissors and chop off bits that you've dedicated time and effort to writing. Does it feel like, oh, you know, you put all this effort, all this time, and now is there a reluctance that needs to be overcome?
Absolutely. In my case, I treasure every word. You know, there's a reason why they say kill your darlings. Every scene I have to cut, I'm like, oh, really? Must I? Why?
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's very, very hard until you realize it has to be done. You know, it's once I realize that the right thing to do is to go and delete everything I wrote for the last 2 days and go back half a chapter or something. Then I usually feel better as soon as I'm starting over again, because sometimes I can write my way into a scene and then get lost and then not be able to move at all because I just can't remember where I was trying to go exactly. Does that make sense? And then I often find just cutting it completely, going back, you know, 2,000 words or whatever, and starting over sort of helps break that jam. And sometimes having done that practice run makes the next one easier. But at the same time, I always feel like maybe I've lost something. There's maybe a paragraph that was way better in the first version. And sometimes I try to save those. I always, if I'll cut something that substantive, I'll move them to an old file and I'll save them just because maybe there's something there that could be useful. I almost never actually go back and look at them once I've done this, but I save them just in case. There've been a couple times where I think, maybe I'll go back, but usually it doesn't happen. But saving those files is, you know, it's an easy thing to do, right? It's not like it's labor intensive to keep an extra draft Word document around. So it's an easy thing. Oh, did we lose him?
Jose, are you there? No.
Oh, yeah, okay. He's frozen. Well,
he's frozen. Oh, he's back.
There we go.
All good? Not quite. Okay. So I have a
We can
question for
see you,
you.
but not hear you, Jose. But no, sorry, Susana.
Yeah, I have a question. So you weave a lot of history, philosophy, literature, even pop culture into the story. Is that intentional or it just happens while you're writing?
A lot of it's intentional, but there have been a couple times where people have said, "Hey, is this a reference to X, Y, or Z?" And I'll look at it and be like, "Oh, yeah, I guess it was. Whoops." Those are always very embarrassing. It's more fun when I did it on purpose. When it's an accident, it feels like I was cheating. But a lot of it's deliberate. I There's the prevailing attitude, I think, in science fiction among science fiction readers is that each work of science fiction should be like a new creation, and that it shouldn't be in conversation with or part of a tradition of literature, which is strange to me because as a as sort of a classic student, that's not how people thought until the last century, really, right?
Mhm.
Like the whole tradition of literature, sort of globally, but of Western literature specifically, because that's sort of what I'm familiar with, is deeply hyperlinked, right? It's deeply sort of interconnected. You can't read Shakespeare, right, and be ignorant of Homer, right? Like you need to, like, if you know Homer, it enriches Shakespeare, right? And you need to know scripture and all of these things, and it's like a whole. I mean, they call literature the great conversation, right? And
Mm.
the attitude of science fiction fans is very often that the opposite of that. It's like I don't want to see any of this. I remember there's a I have not read The Expanse, but I remember hearing that in The Expanse at one point someone quotes Dune. And this brings a lot of people out of the book, and I was like, "Why? It's supposed to be our future. You think that like all the copies of Dune disappeared?" Uh,
Exactly.
I've always found that strange. And this is the thing with Dune itself, which I adore the original Dune novel. But so much of our history is gone in Frank Herbert's future. It's just completely forgotten, and that's not how we treat our own history. If you look around, the stuff that's really old, artifacts from Egypt, for example, right, or the text from the Library of Ashurbanipal, right, or like Gilgamesh, for example. The fact that we still have them and that they're so old makes them more valuable to us. We care about them, and so I think that if we run our clocks forward 20,000 years, I think the stuff that will still remain from now will be even more important. So I wanted to do this sort of world that was like very Dune-esque, but was sort of counter Dune in this way.
Mhm.
Um, so that was like a very conscious decision. Sometimes they're just silly jokes, though, right? Like I have a rule, like every Star Wars movie, they always say, "I have a bad feeling about this" in every movie. I have a stupid joke where in each book, someone will misattribute a quote to Shakespeare in each book, and like I'm always delighted when I realize, oh, I can finally do it in this one. Or like I have like another rule where I always put in a Star Wars prequel joke. There's always a line of dialogue from one of like Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, because those movies they're very silly and they're very quotable. So I always put one in the book just as an Easter egg. I think one book has two, which was a goof on my part, but
I think I missed those.
but I like putting Easter eggs in. I think it's fun, and you can range from like those very silly ones all the way up to like pretty meaningful, substantive things, right? There's a lot of Dante in the second book, for example, and that's like very like that's being done very intentionally and very seriously. It's not I'm not trying to be too cute about it. Um, so
Mhm.
I try to do a bit of everything, I guess.
Because there is a bit of everything. I'm always delighted when I find new stuff. And this leads to my next question, because there is a lot of it. How do you manage to do it without breaking the narrative, without coming across as an info dump of something completely unrelated? Because you weave it so seamlessly into the narrative. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Can we learn such power?
I actually think I have a really technical answer for this question. I hope it's useful. Um,
Mhm.
I find that like the easiest way that you can keep your prose from either tending towards info dumping or from just becoming too samey in any other way, right? Like maybe you fall into that trap that we all fall into where it's just all dialogue for like 4 pages. I'm really bad about that sometimes. Is to look at the way you start each paragraph. Like literally what the first character in each paragraph is. For me, I'm writing first person. So if I look at a page and I see every paragraph has been the word I, right? I'm probably doing too much of something, whether that's movement or rambling in Hadrian's case. If I see, on the other hand, a lot of quotation marks and I see a lot of short paragraphs, I know it's really time to take a break and blow one of the paragraphs out and have some more description, some more action. Because you don't want the characters to fall into a white space, right, and have nothing physically happening, right? You don't want them to just be dialoguing, like I'm not writing a stage play script, right? Info dumps you can usually recognize by like the giant paragraphs, right? And if you find that you've written 2 pages of nothing but gigantic 10, 12 line paragraphs, you probably like should go back and put more dialogue in. Or break it up with more action. And so I think info dumps are something you can physically see if you take a step back and actually look at the manuscript from about 5 feet away, because the paragraphs are like visibly longer most of the time. And if that's happening, that's where I need to spend my time revising. Like I said, this will help. This helps me identify not just that, but all sorts of things like the dialogue problem and stuff. So I think it's actually something you can physically see, and it's easier to see if you actually take a literal step back. So I do that a lot because if you fall into any sort of rhythm, right, whether that's the info dump like long paragraph thing, or too much staccato dialogue, or the same like 5-line little action paragraphs, your reader can get lulled to sleep even with a fight scene because the rhythm gets too melodic, right? It gets too repetitive. And you like as with music, right? Like you need to change the time signatures up and the tempo and things in order to keep your audience actively listening. Because if you just fall into the same repetitive pattern, you've sort of lulled people into not thinking, right? And you don't want them to not think when they're reading prose. So things need to change. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm rambling a little bit.
Yes, absolute sense. I am fascinating. It makes perfect sense. I'm taking notes.
I just worry sometimes I'm just like speaking too much.
It's a great answer. I will pay attention, especially when I'm editing, to avoid that. So it's a great answer.
Yeah, editing is the worst too. It's my least favorite part of the entire process. I would much rather the first draft is a delight, but the rest of them are all nightmares.
I agree.
Yeah, it's just terrible. I as soon as I'm finished writing the book, I complain about everything until the proofreader is done. My wife's like, I thought the last step was your least favorite part. I'm like, well, I forgot about this one.
When you second guess every word, just at least in my case.
Yeah, no, I still do too. I remember I opened Empire of Silence. I got my hardcovers in the mail from my publisher, and the first line of dialogue in the hardcover is missing a word, and I was devastated. I can't remember. It says it should say "is in." I can't remember the line, but it says just "is." So the word "in" is missing, and I heard it in the audiobook. I was listening to it. I was like, "Oh no!" So the audiobook and the hardcover first edition of Empire of Silence are missing a word in the first line of dialogue, and I just, to this day, I'm devastated. I'm haunted by this mistake.
That's tiny. Don't worry.
It's so painful.
But I totally understand. Yeah, it just stays with you. Things that no one else is going to notice.
Yeah, nobody has ever said a word to me about it, but it haunts me to this day. So. We can see you, Jose. The mic's still out. But yeah, no, editing is such an odious. It's such a thankless job. The end results are worth it, but it's just so awful. So Jose said you write Slipstream.
I write mythological Slipstream. That's what I call it. But it's completely out there. Basically, I'm working on a continuation of several mythologies and weaving them together. it's bonkers and entertaining.
No,
And,
well, bonkers is the object. I often think
yeah,
that's where the originality these days comes in, right? Because so much has been done, but going really off the wall often is where the new stuff is. That's why I was very excited about this last book because it gets very strange. So I have this experience. I'm writing and I'm do something I do something I know is weird, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to hear about this in a year. And and
I
that's all.
can't wait for the movie adaptations of Sun Eater. I think they will be amazing.
Oh, I think
Or the
that'd
TV
be.
series, whatever. But I want to see that on screen. It's beautiful. And it's worth mentioning, since we didn't at the beginning, that the arcs for Disquiet Gods are available.
Yeah, so Baen Books is sort of unique, at least in I don't know if anyone outside of the English speaking publishing world does this, but in America at least, they're the only science fiction publisher that sells their advanced reading copies. So you can go to their website, Baen.com, Baen.com, and look up Disquiet Gods, which is the new book in the series. You can purchase a digital copy of the advanced reading copy, which is super cool. So the book's not out until April, but you can read it today.
Yeah, I have.
Nice.
It's great. I'm on chapter 15,
cool.
And wow, yeah, it's definitely worth it. I had high hopes, and so far not disappointed. And I can't wait to know what's going to happen next. It's one of those books.
Oh, that is a great relief to hear. I'm always so anxious when the new books come out. It's always very nerve wracking. I will check, like, I don't read reviews if I can help it. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but I will look at like the numbers on Goodreads and I'm like, okay, it's still 5. All right, ooh, 4.9. Oh no, 4.8. Oh, which is of course like that's inevitable, right? Like if you one 4-star review will drop things, but I always I can't help myself. I have this sense that if one ever comes in at like 3 stars, I'll know I did something wrong. But so far they've all been, the reviews, the numbers have been holding. But I never read the actual comments. I just will look at the numbers. But everybody seems happy with book 6 so far, which is a great relief.
Well, I can only speak for myself, and I am very happy. It's funny. I'm kind of late to the party. I've heard about Empire of Silence when it came out, but I haven't read it until last June. Just there was so much hype around it that it kind of put me off.
I totally get it.
Weird, right? And I only read it because I was looking for stuff to take on holiday, audiobooks mostly, and it was narrated by John Lee, and I really enjoy his narration. I figured, oh, well, why not? And I just got all books. I had to get my hands on the paperbacks, and then there was rumors that, oh no, there might not be another one, change publishers, oh no, drama. And I was like, no, this series has to be completed. So I've been shouting to the world, I said, go get it, because I need to know how this ends.
The German editions, I think we have the first 4 books on contract, so there's at least one more on the way. And it's been a delight working with Kirsten. She's such a wonderful person. She's so fascinating. And we've had a lot of really long conversations about just the process of translation in itself. I, like too many Americans, am monolingual for my sins. But I of course fascinated by linguistics. I don't have a head for actually learning languages in real time. So being able to sort of puzzle through the sort of difficulties in getting things to line up. I think with the German translation, my favorite thing was people call men of sort of normal station in the Empire Messer, Messer, right, which of course is knife in German. And so she's like, "What do you want me to do about that?" And I was like, "Oh, just say hair. It'll be fine." But it's really fun sort of puzzling through all of that.
It's funny you say that. I would guess that you do have quite a knack for languages, considering the amount of not just wordplay, but made up languages, with the Sealson and all that. I mean, That takes skill.
Yeah, just not in real time. I took Japanese in high school, and after 2 years of that, we were having spoken components to our exams, and I would end up there, and my teacher would be like, uh, oh gosh, Ohayo gozaimasu, Rakkyo-kun, genki desu ka? And I would be like, genki desu. And I can't think quickly enough. So I moved over to Latin because there was no expectation that I should speak in Latin class. They're not training you in Latin class to speak to Romans. Maybe to Catholic priests, but even there, that's a skill that's in relatively short supply these days. So I sort of cheated. I took a language requirement that didn't expect me to speak, and it's easy, to do the foreign language thing when you're working with the books, right? So like Jadian is like a weird mix of Farsi and Arabic and Italian, and so that's sort of a fun puzzle, but it's I don't know how well it would hold up, in conversation. Certainly, I'm no Tolkien, though I'd like to be, but.
Closer. Oh, Jose, still can't hear you.
Is it just muted on StreamYard? Maybe. I'm so sorry.
We really can't hear you. Write it down. What can we do?
No, we will figure it out.
Okay.
Ooh, no, I feel terrible. But no, it's something I wish I were better at in real life. I've been trying to learn Spanish for the last 2 years with my phone, but it's been, it's one of those things. It's strangely a different skill, I think, than sitting down and puzzling through these things.
Well, no one will be able to tell.
Yeah.
No, Jose. Read. Do you want to restart? Okay.
These things happen. StreamYard is difficult sometimes. That's for sure. Oh.
And I think we are still live. Okay.
Yeah, he must have just been logging himself out or something.
Okay, so I have one question from my husband, who's also a great fan. And we have time. And I had to write it down because I asked him to type because it was that big. So I'm going to read it.
All right, I'll brace myself.
I didn't think we'd have time for it, but apparently we do. So
no, it's all right.
It's a question concerning the author's influences. There seems to be lots of homage references going on throughout, and I'd like to know a little more about a couple that stand out to me. Bear in mind, I'm still only partway book 3. Anyway, but he's loving it. In the first 2 books, there's subtle hints at what I took to be Robert Chambert's The King in Yellow.
Yes.
Borgossos instantly clicked in my head as Carcosa, based on context and descriptions, and with Karn being initially referred to as the King of 1,000 Eyes, as being clothed in yellow or gold, and eventually even directly called the King in Yellow. Then shortly into book 3, we have a direct reference to somewhere called Sarnath, the doomed city of Lovecraft, perhaps?
Yes.
He's loving it just for all the Lovecraft and Warhammer references. So.
Yeah. I honestly, so the Warhammer ones are sort of a false positive. The sum total of my exposure to Warhammer is I read one short story by Peter Fehérváry, because I had one of my readers recommended I invite him to an anthology I did back in 2020, wow. Which was the first thing he'd ever written that wasn't Warhammer. But I read one of his Warhammer stories to get a sense of his writing going into that. So I actually have very little exposure to Warhammer. I can't really explain the similarities there. It's that and Red Rising I can't explain. But the Lovecraft stuff and the Robert Chambers stuff is quite deliberate. Great admirer of Lovecraft's work. And I love, Ambrose Bierce and Robert Chambers and Clark Ashton Smith and all of those guys. The really early sort of period of science fiction, like the pre-Campbellian stuff, is really where my heart is. And so with Karn and with Vorgosos, I wanted sort of less to make it such that like that stuff was literally Chambers's characters or anything. I just wanted to sort of touch on the feeling and the note. And Hadrian, of course, has probably read Chambers at some point in his life, and so he is sort of drawing on that imagery himself as an illusion. So a lot of these illusions are because Hadrian has read this material. He you'll notice is constantly listening to audiobooks. He never says this outright. He doesn't use the word audiobook, but he is his future smartphone equivalent is speaking to him constantly. And he's of course lived for hundreds of years, so he's read a lot more than any of us will get the chance to. So he's drawing on a lot of this stuff. The Lovecraft thing in particular, right, is if you read Lovecraft, right, he references a lot of the other writers that he's working with at the time, because this idea that like we each as writers should make our own world wasn't something that had really happened yet, right? So if you read Lovecraft, he will refer to Clark Ashton Smith a lot, right? I'll refer to Robert E. Howard a lot in his writing, and that's because they were all sort of writing stories that they were trying to embed into our world, right? They weren't trying to write like a Middle Earth, even Middle Earth is actually our world, right? But they weren't trying to make a secondary world fantasy, right, as we call it. They were trying to create mythology that fit into our world, right? And so if you read Mountains of Madness, Clark Ashton Smith is mentioned by name in the story. Edgar Allan Poe is mentioned by name in the story. And the Shoggoths, of course, make the same noise that the creatures from Poe's Antarctic story make, right? And that was because they were all supposed to be part of the same sort of super mythology. It was just an artificial mythology these writers were all collaborating on making. And so Hadrian does not know that Sarnath was invented by a fiction writer in the 20th century. He just thinks it's a myth that exists. In the same way, there's a lot of Tolkien references in the text as well, but you'll have like the Valar mentioned alongside the Olympians as old gods that people had, right? Hadrian is like not 100% clear on what was expressly fiction when it was created and what was sort of the evolved pagan cultures of one group or another, because there's been enough time that these things sort of blend together and get confused. The
bit about Prometheus and Jove was one of the favorite. I was delighted reading that. That was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a sly little Silmarillion reference in there as well, hiding in there. It's I love whenever I have an opportunity to mess up an old myth. It's very fun. I like. I think my favorite is I've conflated Pandora's box and Schrodinger's cat. I put
that's another one that is exactly the sort of thing that I love, that I write about and I love reading about, and just that's
amazing. Yeah.
Right.
Jose, we got you back.
I think I'm so. This is embarrassing, and I'm so sorry. This is the one day I need everything to work.
No, not at all. I
got you covered. Everything's fine.
That's why you're here, Susana. Really sorry. So the reason we started reading your series, Christopher, it was myself and Ian, who's here in the chat. We read The Wheel of Time a couple of years ago, and when we finished that, we were discussing which series to pick up next. And your series got sold to us as sci-fi for fantasy lovers. And in conversation with David, like at heart, I think your books read more like a classic fantasy series than sci-fi. I've read very little sci-fi. So why the choice of setting?
Well, my fantasy is my first love. Like I said, it was really Tolkien that took me from me. Before I read Lord of the Rings, I was mostly reading like Star Wars tie-in books, right? I was reading like The Adventures of Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? Like the like kids books, right? And I was reading Timothy Zahn, who is, Timothy Zahn's tremendous, but I was mostly reading stuff that was related to the movies that I was watching as a kid, right? Because it was film that was really my sort of gateway into being I guess, a nerd, right? So Tolkien really sort of elevated the whole thing for me, and it has mostly been fantasy that I've read. Although weirdly, like I've never read Robert Jordan, I've never read Stephen Erickson, I've never read like any of the giant series, right? Strangely enough, but Lord of the Rings notwithstanding. Of course, it's not, it's one book really, right? But there's sort of two threads here. The first is that like I like both of these things, and I really like it when they're together. I've also deeply been influenced by anime and by video games, and the Japanese are not so careful about keeping the science fiction away from the fantasy. If you play a lot of like Final Fantasy, for example, you'll find science fiction elements and fantasy elements in the same world with like no problem, right? This is very common in anime as well. And I've always liked, if I can have both wizards and robots, that's like way better than just having wizards or robots. Like it's very fun for me. It's why I love Gene Wolfe. I love Jack Vance. They both do this as well. It's why my favorite Conan story is Tower of the Elephant, right? There's an alien in it. Like, it's great. And that's why I love Lovecraft so much too, right? But the other thread is that fantasy is like a much larger market. And there are a lot more readers for fantasy. There are a few reasons for this, but my basic instinct was that essentially people think science fiction is hard, right? They think that if there aren't sort of lifelong science fiction readers, they believe there's something intrinsically difficult, more difficult about reading science fiction than fantasy. They think, I don't have a physics degree, I don't know what quantum mechanics even means, as if anybody does. They think there's something, they need to be qualified to read the books. Fantasy people don't feel that way. Fantasy is like, I like dragons, I like knights, castles, all very cool. And so I think the barrier to entry is less intimidating. And so I thought, why don't I just write a science fiction series, but make it sound like a fantasy? And then as I started to go on, I was like, but what if actually, hear me out, what if it just got more fantastic as we went along? And so I've sort of ended up writing the series that's sort of, in a lot of ways, the reverse of a lot of fantasy series. Because in a lot of fantasy series, you have the sort of like world of magic is sort of fading. It's on its way out. The elves are leaving Middle Earth, right? And Sun Eater, in a lot of ways, is about sort of like re-enchanting reality, right? It's about moving from a world that is sort of very black and white, very material, or very gray, even actually, very material, very sort of like hard science fiction kind of. That first book's a lot more grounded than the later books are. The series gets increasingly expansive and mysterious and weird. We're talking while you're gone about sort of the connections to Lovecraft and to Smith and Bierce and Chambers and all of those guys, and sort of the more fantastical early science fiction sort of horror writers, who I owe a lot to. And so as the series has gone on, the world has opened up. It's gotten weirder and stranger and more like a fantasy series. But I always intended to write it like one, just for sort of calculated market reasons, I guess.
Right. But because I think you raised some good points there. I'm much more of a fantasy than a sci-fi reader.
Yeah.
And I did struggle with a couple of things in your series, which is something that Susana loved, and it really grounded me. I think it's in book 2. They're traveling for however many years to meet with Karn Sagara, and they're traveling for years. And the fact that Hadrian has to wait for like an hour once he's there to meet with him, and he's getting all nervous, and why am I waiting so long to be seen? And it's like, dude, you've traveled for years in a stasis, and now you're getting annoyed by this half an hour waiting time.
Well, he wasn't awake for most of that, right? He gets better at it, but yeah, no. This is one of my perhaps greatest anxieties writing the series at all is time management.
Because I wanted to ask you about that. Like, do you keep a timeline? Because between books 4 and 5, there's a lot of traveling, and people age at different rates, and the fact that some characters are still alive by the time they get there, Do you have an internal timeline, or are you hoping that no one studies too much in detail the series?
It depends on the detail. There are some things where I've been like, it'll be fine. But the important stuff I keep track of. I'm very happy. When I moved publishers here for book 6, they said, look, like this book is really, really long. Paper has gotten really expensive since 2020. Don't do the glossaries anymore, right? I have these extensive sort of glossaries in the backs of the books, which I only put there because my mother is like, I can't remember what anything is or who anybody is. Can you please? And I was like, okay, Mom, I got you. My mom has since realized she can just call me and ask. So I don't have to do this for her anymore. As I told her, look, new publisher doesn't want to do the glossaries. She's like, oh no, how will I manage? And it's like, I'm your son. Just ask. When we got through the book, when you print books, you can only print in multiples of of 2, right? You have to print pages in a certain number, right? So it depends on the printer, but you might have to print in pages in multiples of 8 or 16 or 32. Usually more than that isn't done, right? In the case of most standard American hardcovers, it's 16 pages. So we ended up with like 11 extra pages in Disquiet Gods, and like, hey, what do you want to do with these 11 extra pages? So I actually got to print a piece of the timeline. I stripped out a lot of the irrelevant stuff and kept it down to just Hadrian's life and like how old he is at each point in the story, relative to everybody else and what the years are and everything. So in the back of Disquiet Gods is a timeline that brings Hadrian from his birth all the way up to the end of book 6. So if anybody's like, oh, there's a timeline, great. Don't read that one until you finish book 6 because it has book 6 in it. So it's good for the end of the book. I did not do what Gene Wolfe does and spoil the book in the front of the book, like he does in Book of the Long Sun with his dramatis personae. It just tells you who the characters are, which it can be dangerous. But so don't read that one until the end. But I did get to print some of the timeline, which is great.
Right. And then can I ask you something that I felt? Kingdoms of Death.
Yes.
It is my perception. I think that you broke your own rules, and you can correct me because possibly I'm wrong. Okay. So throughout the books, Hadrian can sort of swap with his other selves from parallel universes, and that's how he survives. Spoiler for people: the battles with some of the CLs in generals, right?
Yeah.
But he does something new that hasn't been established before in Kingdoms of Death when he reaches out for the High Matter Blade. Now, you didn't show us that was a possibility before. And when I was reading Kingdoms of Death, I was like, he's not getting out of this. There's no way he's getting out of this. He's gonna, and then all of a sudden, you do this thing, and I felt a little bit like that was cheating.
I see.
How wrong am I?
Okay, so I can't tell you exactly why you're wrong yet, but I will be addressing that. There's an answer coming.
Okay.
But the short answer is that Hadrian does not necessarily understand what's going on all the time. He's doing his best. He's not stupid, but what's going on is always so weird and strange that he doesn't understand even how his own abilities function. What he thinks is happening with his powers is not exactly or is not all that is happening with his powers. And he will get more clarity on that moving into the last 2 books.
Okay.
So this is something I'm working on now. But there is a reason why he can do stuff like that. There's a lot of, particularly in this last book, there's a lot of even weirder stuff that he will be able to do. So hopefully it will all just be cool and everybody will think that it is super interesting and fun. But I do understand feeling like that was a cheat. I tried to set that up a little bit earlier in the book when he speaks to his other self. Well, here's a short answer that I don't think is going to spoil anything. So there's only one timeline, actually, right? It's not that there are parallel universes, Marvel comic style, but like in this one, everyone is like the opposite sex or something. Like it's not like that. You can't just like jump to Earth, 387 or whatever. There's only one timeline, but the universe remembers all of the states that like could have been occupied, right? So in sort of like a sort of quantum sense, right? But in also sort of an extra dimensional sense. So right, like our 3-dimensional universe is like a sheet of oil on top of the ocean, right? And the ocean contains all of these other layers of water that are things that could have happened. And Hadrian's ability basically is to reach down into the depths and sort of pull part of that water up to the surface, right? And sort of mess with it like that. The problem is that Hadrian's consciousness has been altered in a way that allows him to see across all of these other dimensions, right? And so the problem here, or the interesting sort of stretch on the abilities, is that these unexpressed versions of himself who also have this power can also do this from the other parts of time where they exist. So he doesn't quite understand this, but he is able to even the versions of him that are not actual or have some sort of agency in a way that nothing else or almost nothing else in those other brains basically or have agency. Does that make sense? It's sort of, it's very strange, but
yeah, no. But if you're addressing that in forthcoming books, then I look forward to that, because like that particular moment for me. But then my shortcomings as a reader. And
well,
understanding
Hadrian doesn't. He's very vague about these things too. So, he's not a physicist. Neither am I. So like this is also like not really how any of this works in terms of quantum mechanics and things. But yes. Let me get prominent here.
But Amita has a question as well. She wrote before.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Like sort of in an emotional sense. So this is interesting. I spoke with a fantasy writer friend of mine. I won't say who he is. Who told me that like he gets so emotionally wrapped up in what he's writing that he like physically feels pain when his characters feel pain. And I don't say I don't believe him, but like that sounds made up, right? Like I just like it doesn't feel right to me. I am very conscious of the fact that I'm making all of this up, right? Like this is all a story that I am telling. Right? I know writers who feel like, oh, I couldn't possibly kill this character right there, my friend, or whatever. When I have to do something that serious, when I have to kill a character or something, what I feel is not like grief for the character, but I feel a weight of responsibility as the storyteller to handle that part of the story with the seriousness it deserves. For the sake of my readers, right? Like I don't, I know that Hadrian's not real. I know I made him up. I don't know exactly when I made him up. It's been like a lot of my life, but like I know he's not real. Valka's not real, and so I don't like get sad when they're gone. Because here's the other thing too, is that like I can kill a character, but then I can go write another story about them actually, right? Like I can go earlier in the timeline, or I can do something weird and science fictional, right? And bring them back in some if I really want to, and if there's a reason to. So I never really have to say goodbye to any of them, right? So I'm not one of those writers who gets all sort of choked up about it. But I do like, I guess the word is respect. I guess I respect the characters, which also sounds pretentious because like I made them up, right? But you have to respect what you're writing for the sake of your audience, right? And I certainly respect my readers. Except Zin, if Zin's here. No, I'm kidding. But I have to pick on him. But no, but because I want my readers to enjoy the books, and because I take their feelings about the book seriously, I will. I've invested for that reason and not for some sort of personal psychological reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I've got another question, and then we'll take Paramita's one from the chat. But one is the religious aspects of the books that at the beginning they weren't so obvious to me until I read the first novella, The Lesser Devil, and it's like, oh my god, like this is so, it's so in your face here. And then in Kingdoms of Death, it was not until David explained it to me, but you make Hadrian go through his particular Via Crucis, where he, we echo, the falling of Jesus on his way to Golgotha, and they put the mantle on him and all that sort of stuff. Plus, you've got the chantry, which is some kind of organized religion thing going on. The way I see my personal takes are the way I see the world going forward, we're trending towards a more secular society, whereas in your universe, we seem, the religious element has stayed strong in the world. What's the
Yeah.
why?
So well, for me, the world may be, at least in the West, becoming more secular. I don't know that it's true everywhere, right? South of the equator, it's certainly going the other way, right? Like both Christianity and Islam are making a lot of gains in the global South, right? Whilst Europe and America sort of abandon these things. But for me, I've gone the other way. I was born Roman Catholic, raised Roman Catholic, but I went through some experiences as a young man that caused me to give that up for about half my life. And I have since been through some other things that have made me go the other way. Not least of which is meeting my wife, and watching her go through some personal stuff, for which the only relief that she could find was Christ, right? Was the church, and that made me rethink a lot of my sort of earlier arrogance on this subject. I had a very complicated and very difficult relationship with God in my life, and I think that's true of a lot of us. It's very difficult. But for me, well, we talked about. I think this might have been while you were gone. I said Sun Eater was becoming a series about sort of re-enchanting reality. It's because for me, reality was getting re-enchanted, and I can understand why people feel differently. But for me, I have found that things have made a great deal more sense and have become a great deal deeper and more themselves by sort of returning to faith, returning to the church. And I think that science fiction has had very little to say about religion as a genre for most of its history, which is very, very strange, because it is, whether or not you believe a particular thing or not, it is a very important element of human culture and society. And for science fiction writers, like, I have a particular dislike for Isaac Asimov. I find him deeply arrogant on this subject. He because he'll say, like, oh, like, this is all like silly, fairy stories, and what we really need to do is put scientists in charge, which is, a very interesting thing for a scientist to say. Now, of course, Isaac, sure, like, your crown is in the mail. People always, want to empower themselves, which I find unsurprising. But science fiction writers generally are cut from this mold. There are exceptions. I remember Bradbury pushed back on Asimov pretty hard on this point and said that people need these. He said we need these stories, right, to live in. I'm not sure that Bradbury believed in anything, but that people we engage with reality through narrative anyway, right? And if that narrative isn't Christianity, if that narrative isn't Hinduism or whatever, that narrative will be communism, it will be fascism, it will be liking Marvel comics, right? It is very hard for me to look at superheroes and not see pagan gods. I think that people run to them for the same sort of things that they would go to Zeus or Aphrodite for. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't like Marvel comics. I certainly do. I'm more of a DC guy, but that's having written Thor. But Thor, right, is literally a pagan god, right? Jack Kirby was deeply interested in all sorts of mythology, and it shows in his work. So this is an important element of human civilization, and I don't know that it's one that's going away. There's a lot of there's a lot of like new spiritualism that has sort of emerged in the last century. And it sort of happens at the same. It really has emerged in the last three. As the Enlightenment's happening, it's the same time that like occult studies are really blowing up in European history. There's not a lot of, contrary to what people believe, there's not a lot of witch hunting in the Middle Ages at all. The witch hunting is all modern world, right? It starts in the 1600s, and it peaks into the 1700s, and it's in the post Enlightenment era that you start to see Hermeticism becoming like a thing, and you know, and so there's, you know, this weird duality that we observe in modern reality, you know, of hyper rationalism and mysticism simultaneously. It's simply that most people might not go to like a traditional church, but they have strange beliefs. You see people with their horoscopes all the time, right? So I don't know that we're getting away from belief. I think the forms of those beliefs are maybe changing for some people. For me, it was to return home, but for other people, it's different. But what it's interesting is when I started Empire of Silence, I was still a pretty committed atheist. And so when I wrote the Terran Chantry, I wrote them as sort of typical takedown of the Catholic Church that's super common in science fiction and fantasy. Like if there's a religious institution, I'm a great fan of Stargate, for example. And Stargate is very much about dismantling false gods, right? First the pagan Egyptian ones, and then later there's the Norse ones show up, but they're good guys, right? And the series ends with a confrontation with basically space Catholics, right? The Ori, right? And like they're like very obviously based on the Catholic Church, right? They have a crusade, which is strange because they don't have a cross, and so the word crusade means cross, but that's fine. You know, I guess the writers of Stargate didn't know that. They needed a new word. Anyway, so I then was stuck as I was editing the first book with this problem, because it was during editing the first book that I guess reverted to being a Catholic, and I was like, oh, look what I've done. This is really silly. Like this isn't deep enough. I was like, this is like a teenager's critique of religion. I need to do better than this. And so I had to figure out what to do with that. And so I wrote The Lesser Devil, right, in which there's a Catholic priest in the future who explains like, oh, well, the Empire put together this artificial religion in the same way that like science fiction writers tend to think all religions are artificial, which isn't fair. Most of them, if they're not revealed, they're evolved. Usually they're not like, they don't just like happen because someone sat in a room and said, you know, like L. Ron Hubbard did and says, oh, what if I was to make up a religion? That's not usually how it's done. And so I had to figure out what to do with this and how to complicate things and deepen the world and try to take these things more seriously. You know, obviously I've only become more Catholic over the last 5-6 years. And so I had to deal with that element of myself in the writing, because you do have to deal with yourself in writing too. Right. And so, so that has crept in symbolically, you know, through the stories. I hope not in a proselytizing way. You know, I hope for people who don't know much about my culture or my faith that they at least find it interesting. I hope they don't feel, you know, lectured at. But it is at minimum symbolically present in a way that it is in Tolkien, in a way that it is in Wolf, and yeah, I hope that's a good answer.
No, absolutely, and by no means, you know, I'm never critical of anyone, any writer putting in their personal views in their books. I think, you know, you write the book, you write whatever you want, and it's up to me to like it or not. But I've never.
Yeah, I didn't think you were being critical.
No. I just mean in general that, you know, and it certainly doesn't come across that way. It was just interesting because, like I said, I missed it at the beginning, and then when I read The Lesser Devil, and then when David pointed out, it's like, oh my god, yeah, there's certainly something here, and I just wanted to explore that. And then we have a question from Paramita here about, well, it's a two-part. So, how inspirational or intimidating for you to have an entire universe to build and write in?
It's mostly not intimidating. The intimidating part is logistical, right? Because sometimes there'll be a detail that I will have forgotten somewhere. I always use this example. The Cielcin language has 2 words for "and" because I couldn't find where I'd already given it a word in my notes, because my notes are kind of a mess. So I've since gone back and I found the old one, and I've circled both of the words for "and" several times in my notes now. But this is fine. Latin has 2 words for "and." And so, you know, it's okay. Like a language can have 2 words for "and." It's okay. But I didn't mean for that to happen. So I can lose track of details like this sometimes, and that can be frustrating. One of the readers, they're reading the advanced copy of book 6 now. caught a minor continuity error between book 6 and book 3. The problem with it is that book 3 is the one that's wrong. Book 6 is the one that actually needs to be correct long term. So I just can't fix it, at least until I do the Diamond edition of book 3, because I'm re-editing all the books as I'm re-releasing them for collector's editions.
All right.
And so when I do that, I'll correct it, but there's nothing I can do about it in the meantime, which is very frustrating. Because you ideally you want everything to be perfect, and the reality is that first editions of novels very, very rarely are. But I should have kept better notes in this particular case. It was kind of a silly thing to get wrong. But as far as inspirational, that's the real benefit of this is my intention is not to make another science fiction universe ever. If I can tell a story and set it in the Sun Eater universe, I will do that. If I want to write epic fantasy, and I do, then I will set it in its own universe. I have some ideas that require they not be connected to Sun Eater. But my intention is to sort of conserve my world building efforts and keep everything in one place. And because of that, I find that creativity flowers best when you actually have limitations. When you're actually inside a box, I think that you then have to get more creative, because you have to figure out, how do I tell this story inside this box? And this is something I think like any gardener will tell you, that plants do better with trellises and with controlled conditions, right? A greenhouse, it turns out, is often exactly the ticket. And so the Sun Eater universe is for me is for me sort of a greenhouse. I have lots of ideas for stories that I could tell within that context, and the fact that I have this context helps me make those ideas more solid in the early stages. So I have maybe a dozen or more standalone novel ideas for the universe. I don't know when I'll write them or in what order or if I'll write them all, but it's very easy for me to come up with ideas because I have this canvas to already sort of work off of and expand, instead of trying to, breathe a new creation every single time. So it's really nice. It's really nice to have the space. So.
And so talking about your continuity and stuff like that, there's a couple of things that I found, they seem to be kind of discarded plot threads. So at several points through the series, Hadrian has been promised in marriage to a whole array of women.
Yeah.
So what's happening with that? Is that going to come and bite him in the ass at some point in the future? Or is he just going to space travel in stasis and slip his way out of those problems? And yeah, that's how I feel about it.
It depends on the woman. It's possible it depends. It's possible one of those will come back around, but one of them probably won't. So it just depends. I haven't forgotten about one of them though.
Okay. It's just one of those things that when you're reading, and then maybe 2 books later, it's like, oh, but what happened to that?
Where is she? Is she still waiting? What's
Well, and it's the whole thing, what happened to his father, and we got the Brother Crispin novella, but he just sort of, we see his mum, and we don't see her after page 50 of book 1, and we just hear, but we don't know what's happening at home and with his father. And is this all going to be tidied up, I suppose, later?
Maybe not all of it, right? But there'll be more on the family front. It may not be what people expect. It may not be what people want, but I think often, life is not so neat, right? We have this expectation for drama that it should be a lot neater than life. And so sometimes when it's not a very important detail, when it's really important to the plot, you should treat it like it's drama, right? And you should satisfy reader expectations or challenge them in useful ways, right? You shouldn't make The Last Jedi, but you should sometimes tell your readers that what they want is wrong, right? And you should come up with a hopefully a better idea than the one they had in their head, right? But sometimes if it's a less relevant detail to the overall plot, I do try to have things feel more like life, right? And have things just maybe that awkward problem with your family is never resolved, right? Maybe that relationship is never satisfied. I have a friend who just completely disappeared. I have 2 friends who completely disappeared on me. They just stopped talking one day, and I've never heard from them again. right? Like that happens, right? And so there are a couple places, if it's not a key detail, where I'll do stuff like that because I think it makes the story feel more real. And sometimes, I hear people's desires, and I will see if I can find ways as the writer to account for those desires, to satisfy those desires. But I can't necessarily do everything, right? So we'll see.
No, I understand that, and I can sort of parallel that. Like, I'm a teacher, and every year, we graduate a bunch of kids. They turn 18. We send them off to the real world, and we hardly ever hear back from any one of them. And I always tell them, like, I wish it was like in the movies where on your graduation day we project on the screen and so became an engineer and so discovered this or that. Some sort of happy ending. And because I got that in my life almost on a daily basis, maybe I'm looking for fantasy to fulfill that gap that
to not do it. Yeah, no. I specifically with regard to his family, this is something I've been weighing very heavily about how I want to handle it by the end. There is, I will say, there's a bit more very quickly in book 6 that will give you some more information. So you'll have that to look forward to pretty soon.
Okay. And in the world of the Sun Eater, I think, if I get it right, we are in some sort of post-AI event, isn't it? So is that is that a hope that we're going to overcome AI in some shape or form, that rather than it overtaking us?
Yes. Yeah. Basically, it is. I worry frequently about. I'm of a party with Tolkien on this issue. I worry that technological progress, which is not the same thing as progress, right? Although I'm a big fan of air conditioning, is another filthy American habit, I know. But I worry that technological progress is making a world that is not fit for human beings in it. You see this with a lot of science fiction that's like very sort of post-human out there. If you read, writers like even like Ian Banks to an extent, but if you read Alistair Reynolds, who I adore, the characters really feel divorced from humanity in a lot of ways, often because they've given up so much of themselves to machines, to genetic engineering, and I'm very concerned about where that line is. Obviously, in a spiritual sense, but in an actual biological sense, because we have this sense now as modern people that like our minds and our bodies are completely divorced from one another, and we can do whatever we want, right? And it won't possibly affect who we are, right? It won't change our minds or do any serious, permanent, irreversible damage. And I'm not sure that's true. I think that if you take too many chemicals, or you were to move your brain into a big robot spider, maybe you're not the same person anymore. There's got to be a line somewhere. And with AI, it's funny, right? They want the robots to take away all the manual labor jobs so that everybody can be free to make art, but the AI is taking away the art making jobs, actually, right? Which is that's not the universe I think that the technocrats imagined precisely. Obviously I have a personal stake in this as an artist, but it is disconcerting to me that that it is creative jobs that are going to disappear, at least not disappear, but be challenged, be transformed by AI before anything else, right? It's coming for the thing that makes us human. That's very disturbing to me. I find the technology fascinating at the same time, but I was laughing. One of my readers was on Reddit, I think a couple days ago, and used ChatGPT to crack one of the languages in the books and to figure out what language it was, and it was an actual language. And it's like, did you not read the books? You literally went to a Demon DAEMON, right, to get answers about my books. Come on now, like, did you read anything? Have you learned nothing? But I do. I found this problem when I was writing the books, that if the books were about hyper intelligent robots and hyper gene modified people, then the books wouldn't be about people. And people like books about people because stories are about people fundamentally, right? Everybody says, oh, I like character-driven stories. That's actually the only kind of story because it's character that drives story in the first place, right? Plot does not drive story. Characters react to the plot. The characters are driven by the plot, but the characters are still always, always, always driving the story. It's just some writers focus on that less, or they aren't as good at it. But stories are about people. And
put that on the T-shirt, please.
yeah, I will. Yeah, sorry, that was a soapbox a little bit,
but you've got in the series, you've got the Empire, which seems to be sort of fairly kind of your anti-mingling of the human and the technology. But then you've got, is it the Jalians, the people that sort of the Extrasolarians that have got this sort of hybrid human/machine, or at least technologically augmented humans, and they don't necessarily come across as less human.
Some of them though. So I look. I recognize, right? Like for example, with the body augmentations, right? That an amputee should have a prosthetic, right? I'm not saying that like that's a problem, for example. So like it's like I said, there's a line somewhere, right? But I think trying to restore functionality is very different from I want to transplant my brain into like a giant robot spider, right? And walk around in that, because I think that would be cool. I would finally I feel in my heart of hearts that I am a giant robot spider, and how do we use science to achieve my goals is I don't think we should live in a world where people have that option. But
Valka is somewhat technologically augmented.
That is true. That's true, right? Because again, like the real world is messy, right? It's very easy to say that, well, this should just be illegal, right? But actually, it turns out it's very hard to make something illegal. Declaring, for example, that there should be no firearms in your country is very difficult unless you're Japan. They're especially if they're already on the ground, right? How do you necessarily repossess everyone, for example? Some people will not return them. Some people will say, oh, I lost them. They fell off of my boat. And then you have this problem where there are still the thing that you've made illegal around. So if you say no more robots, right? They're going to be robots somewhere, right? And the Extrasolarians are those people, right? They're the people who didn't listen when the Empire said no more robots, right? And then the Tavrosian are people who said no to the no more robots ban, right? And then they managed to get away with it under limited circumstances. Right, because they have the muscle to sort of back up their no, right? A lot of politics ultimately is simply violence implied, right? And so these states have had the ability to say no in the setting and to get away with it. Hadrian is enough of a person, capable of nuance that he'll be like, look, I don't like this, but I'll make an exception for you, right? People do this all the time, right? You have people who will say people's revealed preferences are not the same as their bespoke ones. People will say I don't like eating in loud restaurants, but they go to a bar, right? And well, you say that, but you do it all the time, right? Or people will say I couldn't possibly be friends with somebody who smokes, but their childhood friend actually smokes, and so they'll say, wow, that's super gross, don't do that near me, but then they'll stand outside with them anyway. I might be talking about myself here, but you get the idea, right? People will say one thing and then they'll sort of be quiet and they'll not live that principle. So Hadrian may say, I'm not so sure about this brain augmentation, and then spend his life, right, with a woman whose brain is augmented, right? Because, well, not her, right? She's fine. She gets a pass. She was like that when I met her. It's fine. But people are messy like that. People are contradictory, and so I try to do that in the writing. I worry that sometimes, sure, it might confuse people, but humanity is messy, and
I like that, and I like. Maybe I'm just because you mentioned before, and I'm really sorry when I had those issues with the technology, but talk about the transferring your mind to a container, a body. That's that Lovecraft story, isn't it? It's that Whisperer in Darkness or the Fungi from Yugoth, isn't it? Where you got access to travel a space and time, but there's a catch. that your brain is going to be kept in some tin somewhere there. Is that an echoing of Lovecraft there in that part, or
not expressly, but that's one of those cases we were talking about how like people will say, "Hey, is that a reference?" And I'll be like, "Oh, I can see why you would think that." I hadn't thought about that before, but so it wasn't consciously that, but it certainly is certainly pulling on the same thread. I think it might be a fair way to put it.
and I'm sure that when you were talking about it, Susana kept very quiet about the fact that she's got no time for H.P. Lovecraft, and she doesn't like it at all. But
That's not true.
Is that for his? Is that for his?
Not entirely true.
Unpleasant opinions, or for his writing style in and of itself?
It's the writing style mostly.
I
find it more palatable in audiobook, but it's also because my husband is a huge fan, and if I was a huge fan as well, we'll be arguing all the time. So I let him be the fan. I like his ideas. I like when his work is adapted and like the adaptations, but the prose, the writing itself doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I think his fundamental sin as a writer is that he doesn't trust his audience. And I think partly that's I think this is funny because people say this about his social opinions. But I think he's a man of his time. I think partly it's a 1920s kind of way of writing. But I also think that like the ideas were so cutting edge that like he felt the need to like over explain everything. I always laugh when I read The Alchemist, which is one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. But like the ending, the plot twist at the end is literally in all capitals at the end of the story, where he's like, "Actually, it's me. I am Charles Le Sorcier," and I'm like, "We know HP. Like it was very obvious that this was the plot, the whole time. You did not need to put it in all caps." I think he did the same thing in The Cave. The reveal at the end that the monster in the cave was just a guy. It was like he was in fact a man. I'm like, okay, HP, we knew. You don't have to do with the all caps. But he doesn't trust his readers to be as smart as him, which I mean, if you look at his biography, it kind of makes sense, right? Like he was very isolated, strange sort of kid. Mm-hmm. But I tend to agree with you. I tend to think that his prose can be pretty alienating. By contrast, I think Howard has aged very well, but as a writer, stylistically. But Lovecraft, I totally get it. I was just curious.
We've got a bit of a metaphysical question here from Paramita again.
I don't know how to answer this without answering it in a Catholic way, which is like to be made in the image and likeness of God, which does not mean to look like a hairless monkey, right? It means to be an incarnate soul, right? I don't believe so. I'm an Aristotelian hylomorphist, right? Which is like a big, silly philosophical way of saying that I don't believe that you can separate the human soul from the human body in an actual way, and I don't think that's in conflict with my religion at all. I think that like to be a human being means that you have to be embodied, and that these things are sort of inextricably sort of linked. I think that you can run the risk of modifying either the body or the soul too much, mostly the body, and sort of damage that relationship. Obviously, we can perform surgeries that don't kill the body but kill the mind, right? At one extreme end. I imagine that we can modify the human brain with enough hardware that it ceases to be a human brain at some point. I don't know where that line is, but conceptually, one can imagine that you could put enough, Xbox parts in your skull to stop being you. How that would work is above my pay grade. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't know exactly where I would point the finger to with regard to that line. But I think there are ways to die without dying, sort of in a metaphysical sense. The machines in brain example is only one of them.
Yeah, and that's sort of coming, isn't it, with Neuralink and all the work that Elon Musk is doing.
Yeah, I am such of two minds about Elon Musk. I love SpaceX is great. Starlink is great, but Neuralink, I'm not so sure about that one. That's not my favorite idea, Elon.
So.
Well,
Well, we're getting kind of to that limit of the time that you know. Thank you. We've taken so much of your time.
Oh no,
But
no.
before we go away, so you're almost done with Sun Eater.
Yes.
What have you got any ideas, or are you going to take some time off? You know, look back and then plan for the future, or are you just going to carry on to whatever your next project is? You mentioned a more
Yeah.
traditional epic fantasy stuff.
That's one option. So I don't plan on taking any time off. I'm happiest writing. I have basically with the baby in the house, I've given up most of my other hobbies. I like fail to make dinner some nights, which is not great. But I am still writing. Writing is my favorite thing to do. I prefer to watching movies. I prefer to playing video games. I prefer to going outside, which is probably not good for me. But I love writing. So I'll move on to whatever is next. Pretty much directly. I'm sure I'll take a week or two off when I finish book 7. I usually do take a little time off when I finish a book, mostly to answer emails. But whatever I move to next won't be as long. Sun Eater was never supposed to be 7 gigantic books. It was supposed to be 4 normal sized books. So I have already been here a lot longer than I intended. I think it's worked out. There's a dearth of very large books being published right now, and there aren't a lot of very long series. So I've sort of lucked into having this little special corner of publishing, more or less to myself at the moment, which is nice. A couple exceptions, of course, but I don't really know that anybody's been writing science fantasy on this scale, so that's nice. So I don't know. I whatever I'll do next will be a standalone novel, or it'll be a duology. Nothing more than a trilogy for the next couple of years. I got to get the kids into school before I try to write another 7-10 book series.
Well, I was going to say that with the kids thing, you're still sort of enjoying the moment where they don't take, they spend a lot of the time napping. When they get to the age of mine, I've got a 5 and an 8-year-old, and it's both of us hands-on, full-on,
all the time.
You're still on the, you're, I don't know which way you want to look at it. I think you're sort of about to get to the tipping point.
Yeah, this is my fear. I'm hoping I can finish book 7 before we get there, because then I can take a little bit of a break. The reality is that I can finish one of these books within a year, working like actively writing like 3 hours a day. So if I can get just a little bit of time, it's all right. So I'm still pretty optimistic about my chances, but whatever I do will be a smaller scale project next. I have a couple sort of like, I guess, Conan-esque characters, not in the sense that they're barbarians, but in the sense that like I could write a series of single adventures with them and they wouldn't have to connect at all, that I would like to work with. I might do something like that. One's more fantasy, one's more science fiction, right? One's more sort of in the middle. I've got a lot of ideas. I'm not suffering for ideas. I just need to figure out what I want to do next, and I'll answer that question when I finish book 7, because whatever I'm most excited about should be the thing I do next. And I won't know until I'm there.
Are you concerned about dramatically switching genres, in the sense that, Joe Abercrombie has written extensively, but it's all within the First Law universe. I don't know, John Wayne is all very traditional, sort of medieval fantasy, Robert Jordan, whatever. And someone that goes from, is it okay to go from sci-fi to traditional fantasy to, I don't know, thrillers, whatever, you name it, and not get pigeonholed and one of your 2 works to suffer greatly because you are known as, no, you are the sci-fi guy. What are you doing writing fantasy?
Yeah, so I do worry about this. I always joke that maybe me going to fantasy would be like Judas Priest putting out a jazz album. It might be a really good jazz album, but man, like, you'd be disappointed it wasn't another Judas Priest album, right? And so I don't know. I am a little apprehensive about it, but I have enough people who say they'd be really interested to see that I think I would be okay. But I also don't know that that'll be the next move. Like, maybe the thing to do is to write something that's still science fantasy that maybe is more fantasy, and then write a fantasy. I don't know. I've got options, but I think that if the books get shorter, I could do more than one a year. I can maybe do 2 books a year at about 150,000 words instead of 250,000 words. And if I do that, maybe the fact that there's just so much happening means that I could get away with it. So we'll see. Like Prometheus says, Bujold and Le Guin did both. So I see no reason why I couldn't try. But I think it'll probably be still kind of a science fantasy-ish thing next. I think the tone will be very familiar, if the world and the characters won't be. But I also you'll see a lot of these characters again. I may not write another Hadrian point of view novel ever again. We'll see. But you'll see a lot of these characters again after book 7, I think.
Right. Sorry, Susana, have you got any?
No, I had one silly question that already been answered. I think I was going to ask if the salesman had been inspired by the raids in Stargate Atlantis, but I think I got the answer to that one.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that actually. Interesting. Maybe a little bit, but I hadn't thought about it. So
not funny. Intentionally, then.
No. I was mostly an SG-1 guy, but I have been watching Atlantis, and now that you say that, I won't be able to unthink it. So. It's all right.
Because I always thought that they were, and I was like, oh, it made them scary, because I always
the Wraith are a little bit silly.
Yeah,
they never quite worked.
You took them to that extra level of scary. Yeah.
I still love McKay though. He's the best.
Is there any? I'm going to ask a silly question as well. Of the Sanita books, is there any one in particular that you're feeling more proud of, or would you think, yeah, that one? Because I've got an opinion on that, but when I hear yours,
this is sort of a cheat. But at the moment, I'm feeling very proud of Disquiet Gods. It's the newest one, so there's a bit of recency bias. But the advanced reading copies out, people can purchase it to read it 3 months early. And everybody seems to think that everyone seems to think it's the best one so far, which is very encouraging. I've finally dethroned Demon in White, at least in some people's heads. But my usual answer to this question is Howling Dark. Howling Dark, which is book 2, is the first book I had to write on a time schedule. After you sell it, the first book you could write, as much time as you want, and then you sell it, and they give you a contract. And they say, hey, we want book 2 in a year. And you're like, oh, no, I don't know how to write one of these in a year. So I had to figure out how to do that. That's when I started outlining. And it was also the smoothest production process of any of them. Disquiet Gods was the hardest one to write by far. Just a miserable time getting that one done. I had trouble with my publisher and all this stuff. But Howling Dark was very smooth to write. It wasn't easy, but it was very pleasant. And it's also it's kind of weird, and it's kind of dark, and it's kind of spooky, and I like the tone of that. I like Karn. I love Vorgosos. Those were all very fun things to sort of play with. So Howling Dark has been my favorite book for a long time, but I'm coming around to being most proud of Disquiet Gods. I'm hoping when this is done that book 7 is the best one. As if book 7 isn't everybody's favorite, then I will be sad, because that's sort of where it all happens, right? So
this is what a numbnuts I am. But for me, book 2 was the one that made me question the whole series. I'm gonna own up.
Okay.
It just gave me some serious Wheel of Time vibes, and I was like, oh, book 3, it better turn around, because I felt a little bit like book 2 does a bit of more sort of the groundwork. It's more of a setting. The story, whereas particularly book 3, book 4, book 5, you got the action pieces, the fights with Desi Elson. I think there's a better balance between plot and action scenes and so on. Whereas book 2, I felt like I wasn't quite sure that it got much further, and I was hoping that wasn't going to be the case going forward. And then from book 3, book 4, book 5, they've been getting better and better and better. Ashes of Man for me so far has been the one I've enjoyed the most.
Oh, that's really awesome.
And I think it's done a great work of setting up whatever is going to happen in the next one.
That's awesome. I hope that continues then. I would love for 6 and 7 to be everybody's favorites. So
I don't know. What's your take, Susana?
I really enjoyed Kingdoms of Death, and I am enjoying Disquiet Gods even more. So I think I reckon it's going to become my favorite so far. But Kingdoms of Death was brilliant.
That's awesome. I usually don't meet people whose favorite book is Kingdoms of Death, so that is that's really you are one of an elite few. So I am. I was at a convention this last weekend, and a guy who was like 2 heads taller than me came up to me, and he was like, "Are you Christopher Ruocchio?" And I was like, "Yes." He was like, "I hate you right now. I could hit you." And I said, "What did I do this time?" And he was like, "I just finished Kingdoms of Death." And I was like, "Oh well, in that case, here you go." I completely understand. He was really nice. It was very, very funny. That was sort of how he introduced himself. But no, that's awesome. I like I like how everybody seems to have like a different favorite. That tells me like they're all pretty okay. So
So you go to convention. So like moving up, because being a writer is more than just writing the books. Then you got to put on your marketing hat on and go out there. So obviously you're here today, which is unbelievable for me. I think Susana nearly fell off her chair when I emailed her that you had agreed to do this conversation. How is it a chore for you to be here, to go to conventions, to have to do that part of the job, or are you selective about how much you engage?
No, I try not to say no to anything really, because you never know what's going to be the thing that really helps, right? It's certainly not a chore to be here. I love doing these sort of live stream conversations. They're a delight, and it's been very nice to meet the both of you. But conventions are hard. Conventions are 3, 4, if it's Dragon Con, 6 days away from my family, which I don't like, especially now that I have a daughter. And it's a lot of work. And I also I'm very introverted. Not in the sense that I'm not conversational or antisocial, but being social makes me exhausted. So if I go to a convention, then like the next week, maybe 2 weeks, I am not very productive. It takes me a very long time to sort of recenter myself. So I'm currently that's part of the reason why this has not been a good writing week. Is I've come back from Virginia and I'm trying to get my life back together. And like the house is a mess, or like I have extra laundry I have to do now, and it's just like nothing's where I left it. Damn it, and everything's just the sort of the flow is broken. And so much of writing is momentum for me. I try not to take a day off at all. If I want a break, I'll write less on one day, but I won't stop, because if I stop, then I might forget what I was doing, and that can be bad. So conventions are very hard on me. I try to only do a couple a year, just because it takes me so much longer after the convention to get my life back together. But I'll probably do half a dozen a year. As a rule, the last few years that hasn't been true because the world has been so upset. But before 2020, I did about half a dozen or more a year. But especially the internet, I don't know that they're necessary, but it's good to do that and to be out in the world and do these things.
Mm-hmm. And sort of finally, how important, and you can just wax lyrical about the support from your wife, and how important has it been to have someone that allows you and encourages you to do this thing that it's not for everyone at all, is it?
Yeah, well, my wife's funny about this. She has not read the books, and I kind of don't want her to, because I know some writers whose wives or husbands are like their biggest fans, and I find that a very strange marriage dynamic. So fortunately that's not ours, but she is she's hugely supportive. She really likes she sort of likes that I am a little bit famous. She thinks that's kind of cool. But she also she makes all the thumbnails for my YouTube channel. She does the cover design for the special editions. She does the like typesetting of the title fonts and things like that. So if anybody got the Kickstarter edition of Empire of Silence, that's her work. She didn't do the art; she just did the lettering, right? But we do all of that together, which is really cool. She like made all the t-shirt designs on my website and stuff like that. She's like hugely involved and supportive. I have stepped away from being on Discord servers and like talking to readers all day because it's gotten to the point where people will tag me all the time. So I had to stop doing that, which is a sadness, but it was time. But she still floats around, and if she sees a question, she will ask me the question, and I will answer it, and she answers my readers for me and stuff, which is kind of cool. But she's, I married her, so I love her. She's, she's amazing. I really couldn't do it without her. So,
No, and I understand. You're not the only one. I read one of Robin Hobb's The Inheritance, the short story collections. And in the preface, she talks about there that her husband doesn't read, or she doesn't let her husband read any of her stories because of the personal elements of her life that they transpire into the stories or the books. And that she doesn't want to have the conversation of, hey, why did you mention this, or why did you put this there, which the general public wouldn't know.
They'd never know that it was a thing like that. Yeah, that's not been so much an element of it for me. I just like I said, I know some writers whose spouses went from being their spouse to being their fan, in sort of the same way that like the like Stilgar in Dune goes from being Paul's friend to being his servant. And like it's a weird thing in the sadness. I don't want her to like look up to me as a creative person. I want her to be my wife. And it's not that she wouldn't read them. She well, if I put vampires in them, she might read them. That might be my mistake. She's a big Anne Rice fan, but but I like that she's not involved in the sort of creative dimension of it, because she would have opinions, right? And she would be like, why did you kill that character? You shouldn't have done that. I'm mad at you now. It's my job. Let me do it. Thank you. I decide who lives and who dies in this house. No, but I'm very grateful for everything that she does. So.
Fantastic. All right. I think on that lovely note, I think this is a good time to call it a day, and to thank everyone that has been dropping in the chat and commenting. And of course, Susana, thank God you were here today, because it would have been really embarrassing with the technical issues that I had. And of course, Christopher, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. It's been very enlightening, and really, really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to meet you both. Jose, Susana, thank you. I hope I'll talk to you again soon.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
All right. Yeah. I'm just going to disconnect now. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
And then